The stranger rode into town at dusk, dust clinging to his coat and silence following his horse. Every eye watched him. None of them planned to let him leave alive. In the far reaches of the frontier, there was a town most travelers passed without noticing. It sat low between two dry ridges, its buildings weathered gray by decades of desert wind. The sign at the edge of the road read, "Raven's Hollow." Though the paint had long since cracked and faded at first glance, it looked like any other forgotten western settlement. A quiet saloon with swinging doors, a general store with crooked windows, a church that leaned slightly to one side, like an old man tired of standing. But something about Raven's Hollow felt wrong the moment a rider approached it. The streets were too still. The wind carried no voices. Even the horses tied outside the saloon stood strangely quiet, as if they understood something. Visitors did not. Late that evening, a lone rider appeared along the southern road. His coat was dark with travel dust. A wide hat hid most of his face. A revolver hung low at his hip, worn from years of use, but polished with careful habit. He rode slowly, not like a man in a hurry, but like someone who had nowhere else left to go. The stranger guided his horse past the town sign and into the main street. Windows shifted slightly as curtains moved. Inside the saloon, a few men paused mid-conversation. A woman sweeping the porch. The boarding house stopped, her eyes following the rider with quiet tension. Every resident in Raven's Hollow noticed the same thing. They had been waiting for weeks, maybe longer, waiting for this exact man to arrive. The stranger tied his horse to a post. In front of the saloon, he stepped down calmly, dust falling from his boots onto the wooden boards of the street. No one greeted him, no one spoke. The town simply watched, because Raven's Hollow had only one purpose left in this dying stretch of desert. And tonight, the trap was finally closing. The only problem was something none of them fully understood yet. The stranger walking into their town might have known about the trap all along. Asterisk, the man who rode into Raven's Hollow was known by many names. Across the frontier, some called him a bounty hunter. Others called him a ghost. But the name written on old wanted posters was Caleb Mercer. Years earlier, Mercer had been something very different. Before the dust of the frontier hardened his face and the revolver became an extension of his hand, he had been a lawman in a mining town far north of Raven's Hollow. A quiet deputy with a reputation for patience rather than violence back then. Mercer believed in order in courts, in justice that didn't come from the barrel of a gun, but the haughty West had a way of correcting men who believed in things like that. The town he once protected had been run by a group of men who hid their crimes behind polite smiles and church donations, land deals, stolen gold shipments, and quiet murders disguised as accidents. Mercer had discovered the truth. Slowly, one ledger, one missing miner, one witness who disappeared before sunrise. The deeper he dug, the clearer the pattern became. The corruption didn't belong to outlaws, it belonged to respected citizens. By the time Mercer tried to expose them, it was already too late. The same men who shook his hand in daylight gathered one night in secret and decided the deputy had become a problem. The fire that destroyed Mercer's home burned so hot, the entire street smelled of smoke for days. Inside that house were two people who had nothing to do with Mercer's investigation, his wife and his young son. The official story called it a tragic accident. Mercer knew better. When he stood in the ashes the next morning, something inside him had already changed. He left the badge behind, but he didn't leave the list, because before the fire, Mercer had copied every name from the ledger he found. 8 men, 8 quiet leaders of that northern town, 8 men responsible for the night, everything in his life, burned away. Over the following years, the frontier began whispering stories. A ranch owner found dead in a canyon with a single bullet through his heart. A banker discovered in an empty train car outside Dodge City. A gambler who vanished after a midnight poker game and was never seen again. Each death looked different, but the result was always the same. One more name crossed off Mercer's list. Most people never connected the stories, but the men who shared that secret ledger understood perfectly well what was happening. By the time the 6th name disappeared, the last 2 survivors had begun making plans. They left the North, changed towns, changed names, and built a quiet little settlement deep in the desert where no one would think to look. Raven's Hollow, a place where the past could stay buried, or so they hoped. But when word finally reached them that Caleb Mercer had been seen riding south, they realized something terrible. Mercer wasn't chasing rumors. He was following the list, and their names were the only ones still left on it. By the time Caleb Mercer rode into Raven's Hollow, the town had already been preparing for days. The men he hunted had made certain of that. They had built quiet lives in the desert under different names, careful to appear like ordinary citizens. One ran the general store. The other owned the saloon. 2 strangers, they looked like the kind of men who helped build towns. Not the kind who burned homes and buried secrets. But when the message arrived that Mercer had been spotted heading south, their calm routine collapsed overnight. They knew exactly who he was. More importantly, they knew what he had already done. 6 men from the ledger were gone. 6 men who once believed Caleb Mercer was nothing more than a grieving deputy who would disappear after tragedy struck. Instead, he had become something far worse. A man who moved quietly. A man who waited. A man who never forgot a name. The 2 men understood something the rest of Raven's Hollow didn't. If Mercer reached them, he wouldn't stop until the list was finished. So they did the only thing they believed would save them. They turned the entire town into a weapon. Raven's Hollow had always been small, but loyalty ran deep in isolated places like this. Over the years, the 2 men had lent money, hired workers, and helped settlers survive the harsh desert winters. Many residents owed them their livelihoods. Others simply feared what might happen if they refused. So when the plan was explained, no one openly argued. They would wait for Mercer to arrive. They would let him walk calmly into town. And when the moment was right, the streets would close around him. Rifles were placed in 2nd-story windows. Shotguns waited behind saloon doors. Men who had never fired at anything more dangerous than a rattlesnake now stood ready to kill a stranger they had never met. That required patience. The town had to appear normal, quiet, harmless. When Mercer tied his horse outside the saloon that evening, dozens of eyes followed his every movement. Inside the saloon, conversations had already gone silent. The bartender slowly wiped a glass that didn't need cleaning. 2 ranch hands leaned against a table, pretending to drink while their hands rested near hidden pistols. Even the piano player stopped halfway. Through a tune, Mercer pushed through the swinging doors without hesitation. For a moment, the entire room froze. The stranger stood there calmly, his shadow stretching across the wooden floor under the dim lantern light. He removed his hat slowly. The man's face was older than many. Expected lines carved by years of desert wind, eyes that carried the kind of stillness most men only developed after witnessing too much death. Mercer stepped toward the bar. No one moved. No one spoke. The tension inside the saloon thickened like approaching storm clouds. Finally, the bartender cleared his throat. What'll it be? Mercer rested one hand lightly on the counter. His voice came low and steady. I'm looking for 2 men. That was the moment several people inside the room understood. Something unsettling. The stranger didn't sound like a man who had wandered into danger. He sounded like a man who had just arrived exactly where he meant to be. The saloon remained silent after Mercer spoke. For a long moment, no one answered him. The bartender forced a thin smile and set the glass down slowly. Plenty of men in this town, he said carefully. You might have to be more specific. Mercer didn't smile back. Instead, he reached into his coat and placed a folded piece of paper on the counter. The bartender's eyes dropped to it before he could stop himself. 2 names were written there. The names those men had once used in the northern mining town. Not the names they lived under now. Their real names. Across the room, a chair scraped slightly against the floor. One of the ranch hands shifted his weight, suddenly aware that the stranger standing at the bar knew far more than he should. Mercer leaned forward, just enough for the bartender to hear him clearly. There. Here, Mercer said quietly. It wasn't a question, it was a statement. The bartender swallowed. Before he could respond, the saloon doors creaked open behind Mercer. 2 men stepped inside, one tall and thin with silver hair, the other broader, older, with the kind of careful posture that belonged to someone who had survived a long time by avoiding risks. For years, they had believed distance would protect them now. The past had walked directly through their front door. The tall man's eyes locked onto Mercer's back. Well, he said slowly. So the stories were true. Mercer turned. The room seemed to tighten around the 3 men as every other person quietly stepped away from the center of the floor. Outside, shadows moved behind dusty windows. Rifles shifted into position. The trap was no longer hidden. The older man glanced around the saloon and gave a small nod. That was the signal. Outside, boots stepped onto wooden sidewalks. Gun hammers quietly pulled back. The tall man looked back at Mercer with cold satisfaction. You rode a long way for revenge, he said. But you should have stayed buried in the past. Mercer studied both men for a moment. Then his eyes moved calmly toward the windows, toward the shapes of rifles waiting in the darkness outside, and slowly, almost thoughtfully, he nodded, as if the trap unfolding around him was something he had already expected. The silence inside the saloon stretched long and heavy. Outside, the quiet town of Raven's Hollow had come alive in the shadows. Boots moved along wooden walkways. Rifle barrels rested against window frames. Men who had never considered themselves killers now stood in positions chosen for them days earlier. Every exit from the saloon was covered. Every angle watched. There was no path out. The tall man stepped forward, his voice calm but edged with years of buried fear. You should have stopped after the first one, he said. Maybe the second. But you kept going. Mercer didn't answer. His eyes drifted slowly across the room instead, counting. The bartender behind the counter. 2 ranch hands near the back wall. Another man pretending to examine a whiskey bottle while keeping his hand near a hidden pistol. Through the dusty windows, Mercer could see the faint outlines of rifles waiting outside. At least a dozen, maybe more. The older man chuckled quietly. You see it now, don't you? He said. This town belongs to us. Every man here knows what happens if we fall. Mercer's gaze returned to him. I see it, Mercer replied. His voice carried no anger, no panic, just quiet recognition. The tall man spread his arms slightly, almost welcoming the moment. You spent years hunting ghosts, he said. But this is where the trail ends. Outside, a horse shifted nervously in the street. The sound echoed strangely through the still air. Mercer rested his hand on the bar beside him, fingers tapping once against the wood. Then he asked a question no one expected. "How long have you been preparing for me?" The two men exchanged a glance. The older one answered first. "Months," he admitted. "When word reached us that you were heading south, we made sure Raven's Hollow would be the last place you ever saw." Mercer nodded slowly, as if confirming something. "Months," he repeated. The room waited for anger, for threats. Instead, Mercer reached into his coat again. Several people tensed instantly. But he didn't pull a weapon. He placed another, folded paper on the bar. The bartender hesitated before opening it. Inside was a map, a rough drawing of Raven's Hollow. Several buildings marked with small black X's. The saloon, the general store, the stable, even the church. The bartender's face drained of color. Mercer spoke quietly. "You're not the only ones who had time to prepare?" The tall man frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" Mercer's eyes moved toward the windows again, toward the rifles aimed into the saloon. Then he said something that made several men outside shift nervously. "It means," Mercer said calmly, "you built a trap?" He paused, and I walked into it, on purpose. For a moment, no one inside the saloon understood what Mercer meant. The tall man laughed first, a sharp, humorless sound. "You expect us to believe that?" he said. "You rode straight into a town full of rifles. On purpose?" Mercer didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached for the glass the bartender had been pretending to clean earlier and turned it slowly between his fingers. The faint sound of glass against wood seemed unnaturally loud in the silent room. Outside, the rifles remained trained on the saloon windows. The trap was still very real, but Mercer's calm had begun to spread an uncomfortable uncertainty through the men watching him. The older man narrowed his eyes. "What game are you playing?" he asked. Mercer set the glass down. "No game." His gaze moved toward the front doors. "Just timing." The tall man's smile faded. "Timing for what?" Mercer looked at him. "For the part where you realize something." The room waited. "You spent months preparing for me," Mercer continued quietly. "Gathering people, positioning rifles, turning this town into a cage." He gestured slightly toward the windows. "And that worked." The tall man nodded slowly. "Yes, it did." Mercer leaned back against the bar. "But there's one problem with traps," he said. "They only work if the animal doesn't understand them." A distant sound echoed faintly outside. Not loud, just enough to make a few heads turn. The older man frowned. "What was that?" Mercer didn't look concerned. "Probably the first sign," he said. The tall man's voice hardened. "First sign of what?" Mercer met his eyes. "That you're not the only ones waiting out there." The words seemed to hang in the air. Before anyone could respond, a rifle shot cracked through the evening. But it didn't come from the saloon windows. It came from somewhere farther. Down the street. Outside, shouting erupted instantly. Boots pounded across wooden boards. One of the ranch hands rushed toward the window and peeked through the curtain. His face turned pale. "Riders," he said. "How many?" the tall man snapped. "Don't know. Maybe 10. Maybe more." Another rifle shot echoed across the town. Then another chaos began spreading through Raven's Hollow like a brush fire. Men who had been calmly waiting with rifles suddenly scrambled for cover. From the shadows at the far end of the street, a group of riders advanced slowly into town. They moved with the quiet precision of men who had done this before. Each one carried a rifle. each one aimed toward the buildings where Raven's Hollow's defenders had taken position. Inside the saloon, the older man stared at Mercer. "You brought them," he whispered. Mercer shook his head slightly. "No." The tall man grabbed his revolver. "Then who the hell are they?" Mercer's voice remained calm. "People who've been looking for the same two men I have." Outside, another rifle cracked. A man screamed somewhere down the street. Mercer pushed himself off the bar and finally let his hand rest near his revolver. The room seemed to tighten instantly. The tall man realized something terrible at that moment. Mercer hadn't just walked into their trap. He had exposed them. All of them. Every resident who helped hide two fugitives for years. Now the entire town had become a battlefield. Mercer looked at the two men from the ledger one last time. "You spent years hiding behind other people," he said. His voice lowered. But tonight, the gunfire outside intensified. There's nowhere left to hide. Gunfire rolled through Raven's Hollow, like distant thunder. Men who had waited patiently behind windows now scrambled through the streets, unsure who they were fighting or where the next shot would come from. The trap had collapsed into chaos inside the saloon. No one moved for several seconds. The tall man still held his revolver, but the confidence that filled the room minutes earlier had vanished. "You led them here," he said again, though his voice carried far less certainty. Mercer shook his head slowly. "No," he replied. "You led them here?" Outside, another rifle cracked. A window shattered somewhere down the street. Mercer's eyes stayed locked on the two men in front of him. "For years," he said quietly, "you hid behind towns, behind workers, behind anyone willing to protect you." The older man swallowed hard. "You think killing us changes anything?" he asked. Mercer considered that. Then he answered with the honesty of someone who had spent too many nights thinking about the same question. "No." The word hung in the room. "It doesn't bring my family back," Mercer continued. "It doesn't fix the things you did." Outside, the gunfire began to spread farther through the town as riders closed in on the streets. But it finishes something. Mercer's hand moved slowly to his revolver. The tall man raised his own gun at the same time. For a brief second, the room returned to perfect silence. Two gunshots shattered it. When the echoes faded, Mercer was the only man still standing. The two names left on the ledger were finally crossed out. Mercer stepped outside, into the smoky dusk. The riders, moving through Raven's Hollow, slowed when they saw him. None of them spoke. Mercer looked once more at the quiet desert beyond the town, for the first time in years. The list in his pocket was empty, but the silence that followed felt heavier than the revenge that came before it. Because some ghosts never leave. They simply stop running out on the frontier. Revenge often feels like justice, until the dust settles and nothing truly feels finished. If you enjoy dark Western stories about secrets, betrayal, and the quiet men who carry heavy pasts, subscribe to Whispers of the West. There are many more forgotten towns, silent gunslingers, and dangerous truths, still waiting to be uncovered in the shadows of the Old West.